So first of all, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. I'd like to welcome you to the Timber Haulers, or what are we calling this? The Pandemic Assistance for Timber Harvesters and Haulers program. I'd like to thank FSA and USDA for helping share this information and answer questions for tribes that have it. And the hope is that the travel programs that we have online will help assist their loggers and truckers with sign up for this program. For those that have tracked this, there was 200 million approved in this year's appropriations bill. I think we've got a deadline for signups of October 1, but recognizing it's a short timeline and recognizing that this is a new program that loggers and truckers aren't familiar with, we wanted to make sure and get as much information out as fast as we could and give folks the opportunity to ask questions to clarify that process in any way possible. So with that, welcome everyone, and I will pass it over to Don for the invocation.
Tatsmewi Katsyayo. It's good morning, and thank you, Creator, in my grandmother's language, Nez Perce, even though I'm enrolled with Umatilla through my father and my mother's Coeur d'Alene. I'd like to thank you for this gathering and for the work that people put in for conducting this webinar for our tribal harvesters and loggers, haulers, and the staff people and forest managers and leaders that help them. Maybe we have some good visions and good thoughts, good questions, and help folks that have suffered under COVID, and also our communities that are having the challenge of our fires. So Kachalia, thank you, Creator.
Thank you so much to Cody and Don and to ITC for hosting this webinar. We really appreciate it. My name is Sherry Wormstead. I'm with the U.S. Forest Service and just supporting the webinar today. Jody just went ahead and shared the slides. So there are some view options at the top where you can set the way that you view. And I suggest that you click the chat button at the bottom to open the chat up to the right. And when you joined, your microphone was muted. You can click the mute button in the lower left corner when you want to speak up and ask a question. And we'll have time for questions today. Also, next to that mute button in the lower left corner, you can click the drop, or it's kind of a drop-up arrow, a little caret arrow, to choose your settings. Or if the audio through the computer becomes choppy for you, you can go to there and look for the switch to phone option to dial in by a phone instead. And then we'll just ask you to keep your cameras off, but then when it comes time for Q&A, we'll welcome you to start your cameras and unmute for the questions. As you heard with the announcement, this session is being recorded today. And so now let's go ahead and look at the lineup of presenters. Thank you. So Julie Tucker from the U.S. Forest Service and Jody Kenworthy from the Farm Service Agency. We're going to do the presentations. We also have with us today Reed Robinson with the Office of Tribal Relations of the Forest Service. And then, of course, Laura from ITC and myself are doing some webinar support. So thank you again to ITC, Cody, and Don for the welcome and invocation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Julie and welcome Julie to come on camera and get started with the presentation.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it. Wanted to just point out that this has been a wonderful partnership between Farm Service Agency and the U.S. Forest Service. And this is just a quote from the head of Farm Service Agency talking about the program and in the collaboration with the Forest Service. Next slide, please. And our outgoing chief, we now have a new Forest Service chief, but she wanted to encourage all the logging and log hauling businesses hit hard by the pandemic to look closely at PATH and consider applying. FSA is all about customer service, and people found this process very easy. Not every situation's clear cut, but FSA is at the ready to help people with applying. Next slide, please. And most importantly, I personally and Forest Service and FSA want to thank Intertribal Timber Council, Cody and Laura and all the folks associated with the organization have been fabulous. And it's absolutely critical when you're trying to establish a federal program like this, that you understand the needs of those that might be applying. And we could not have done this without their feedback and input and having a chance to talk to tribal businesses. So want to give a huge thanks for that. And hopefully this program has been responsive and people find the process very easy. And you'll see in this presentation that there are some differences in terms of how tribal businesses are treated compared to non-tribal businesses. Next slide, please. All right, so this is just an overview in the appropriations from Congress. It gave the Department of Agriculture up to $200 million to provide relief to businesses that do specifically timber harvesting and timber hauling, and that who've lost at least 10% or more gross revenue during a specific 11-month period. It's not a 12-month period. It's a little odd, but it's an 11-month period comparing 2020 to 2019, from January 1st to December 1st. Next slide, please. This just gives you a little bit of an idea and some context in terms of the impact that the pandemic has had. As you can see, there's a 13% drop across the country in U.S. total delivered value of raw wood materials. And also, there are at least 2 different independent teams that did an analysis and for this particular program. And the 2 separate research economists came to the conclusion that overall for the whole sector, it was a hit of more than $1 billion. So based on that, USDA, even though this program was optional, USDA recognized the need. And this is really the first time that these 2 sectors have received, as far as we know, direct assistance from Farm Service agencies. So we're really happy. Clearly the need's there, as we can see from nearly 3,000 people or businesses that have already applied. Next slide, please. Again, this is just showing over $1 billion loss to deliver in the value of wood raw material that's been delivered. And then this map shows, or this figure shows the total number of tons, which is a little over 21 million tons during that period. Okay, I'm going to go over some definitions for PATH. This is important to understanding how you apply or whether you qualify. Next slide, please. So gross revenue. This can be a confusing concept, but hopefully I'll make it simple. We're using a term that's widely accepted in terms of what gross revenue means, and that is the business's gross receipts. Well, what does that mean? It's the total amounts that the business receives from timber harvesting and timber hauling activities without subtracting any costs or expenses. So what that means is you don't do any adjusting for costs or expenses. And I'm sure we'll have some questions near the end and I can get into some details on that. But for the most part, that's the money that's coming into the business, the money that the business is receiving, not money that the business is paying out. Also, and this is based on feedback from some of the timber businesses, and also just in general, timber hauling and log hauling businesses. They gave us feedback before we finally established this program, saying that because of the pandemic, a lot of the businesses had to sell off their physical assets, some large machinery and whatnot, so they didn't go bankrupt or go under. And because of that, and it was great to be aware of that, it's important to realize that gross receipts do not include the sale of physical assets in either of those years, 2019 or 2020. Next slide, please. When filling out the application, you'll need to provide a principal business code. This is fairly standard. It's a 6-digit number that classifies your business, and it's interchangeable with what's referred to as the NAICS, the North American Industry Classification System. And this is a standard coding system that's used There've been a lot of questions around it, and I'll get into what's required to apply, but I can leave that open for when we have questions at the end. Next slide, please. Timber, it's a simple definition, but then when we start to see some of these businesses, questions come up about what does and doesn't qualify. So it's important to understand that timber is, for the most part, trees or logs. Well, trees are harvested from the forested land. And so that tree, when it's harvested, any processing that happens to that tree on the site, at the forested site, is considered timber. It could be turned into slash, it can be turned, the slash would count, and it could be turned into chips. It could even be turned into biochar. It could even be processed into firewood on the site. If it's done on the site, it's considered timber. And so all of this, in terms of, and I'll get into a following slide, it depends on where the processing is happening, whether or not the activity qualifies. Next slide, please. So timber harvesting business is also known as a logging business, and its gross revenue must come from one or more of the following, as shown here. So it's either cutting timber or cutting and transporting timber, or producing wood chips on forest land. Now, really, it's not just limited to wood chips. Again, that's just one example. This is a standard definition that we use for the program. Timber is a broad definition. Any parts of the tree, any way it's processed, would qualify, as long as that's done at the forested site. Now, what's important to understand is that the business must be classified by this NAICS code 113310 for tax purposes. So we're expecting the applicants would have some sort of documentation that shows that NAICS code. But if you don't, have no fear, you can work with the local FSA office in terms of identifying additional documentation that can support demonstrating that you're eligible. Next slide, please. So a timber hauling business is also known as a log hauling business, and its gross revenue must be derived from transporting products harvested from forest land, specifically with vehicles registered as highway motor vehicles. They're used in the transportation of timber. And so the NAICS code for the timber hauling business is these two, 484-220 or 484-230. And in order to apply, if you are a timber hauling business, not a timber harvesting, for a timber hauling business, you need to be able to supply this IRS form 2290, where it shows that you have some information entered in that form for logging vehicles for 2019 and 2020. There is an exception I'll mention later for tribal businesses that operate only on tribal land. All right, there we go. So as you can see in yellow, I was referring to this IRS form 2290. If you are a timber hauling business that operates only on tribal lands, we would not expect you to have that form, and that's okay. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. I'm going to go over eligible applicants, but before I do that, just want to give you some context of what these sectors look like. This shows roughly the distribution of logging and log hauling businesses in the US. As you can see, just hone in on the blue. That's the majority of this sector, which is interesting, sole proprietors. And so they're unique, and we hope that this program is accommodating the needs that are unique to sole proprietors. Next slide, please. This slide, most of you know what timber harvesters are and timber haulers. This was really for some of our FSA leads who, this is a new program, a new sector to them, and they're having to do a lot of learning, but I'll just go over it briefly. Timber harvesters are referred as loggers, and they perform the initial harvesting and transporting of trees for these products. The processing of cutting and processing and moving trees, like skidding, on-site processing and loading of the trees or slash or wood chips onto trucks or rail cars. That's what timber harvesters do. As for timber haulers, they're referred to typically as log truck drivers. That's one thing we told FSA, these folks wouldn't refer themselves typically as a timber harvester or timber hauler. So we're trying to get them into the lingo of, hey, we're loggers or log truck drivers. But anyway, timber haulers or log truck drivers typically use semi trucks or 18-wheelers and other large vehicles to transport the unprocessed wood and logs and lumber products. And they can typically work for a number of different employers or have their own business and also work for a different employer. They're typically work as independent operators, owner operators, sole proprietors, and own their own trucks, and can contract out their services to a lot of different businesses. Next slide, please. All right, so now to get into the nitty gritty. To be eligible, the business must be in operation between January 1st and December 1st, 2019, in 2019 and in 2020, for any part of those periods. FSA understands and realizes that there are seasonal variations in operations in these sectors, and that's okay. Next slide. Also, these are the two main criteria. The business must have had at least a 10% gross revenue loss when comparing the 2020 period to the 2019 period. They also, for each of those two periods, in 2019 and 2020, must demonstrate they have at least 50% or more of its gross revenue from timber harvesting or timber hauling or both of those activities. Next slide. Basic requirements is for the business. Whoever's applying on behalf of the business must be a citizen of the US or a resident alien, but also any of the members of the business. Those are formal legal members or a corporation that owns that business. All of those members must be a citizen or a resident alien, or needs to be an Indian tribe or tribal organization. And of course, minor children are not eligible for a payment under PATH. Next slide, please. And I already went through this and I can answer questions, but basically you need those two criteria. Okay, so eligible applicants, in order to get paid, in order to get approved, FSA needs basic taxpayer identification information. If they don't have that, they can't approve an application or provide or send a payment. So they have to provide the basic information to identify this person who's applying on behalf of the business. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to go over ineligible applicants. Most of the folks in this audience, I think, would understand the difference between these sectors and the ones I'm going to point out, but I will go over it briefly. Next slide, please. I already went over this, so we can skip to the next slide, please. All right. So residential or commercial tree care businesses do not qualify for PATH, and landscape services do not qualify for PATH. Next slide. And timber brokers. Now I do want to go into this because some of you might be timber brokers or might do both sort of, timber broker type of activity, but also have your own business. Timber brokers are people who buy and sell standing timber and logs. They do not physically work with the wood. They're not in the woods cutting trees, processing trees. They're not physically moving the trees. They can work independently or directly for mills. And FSA is on high alert to ensure that anyone who's applying is not a timber broker, because that is not what this program is intended for, because the understanding is that the businesses hardest hit were timber harvesters and timber haulers. Next slide, please. Also, trucking businesses that do not transport trees or logs do not qualify, but it is possible, and we do understand, for example, that for some businesses that are dedicated log trucking businesses, they might do more than just hauling trees or logs. And that's okay. What they need to do is look at the whole of their business and look at all the gross revenue coming into their business, and need to be able to demonstrate that more than 50% or more of the revenue coming into the business is specifically for hauling trees or logs. And then finally, federal government, state, local governments, public schools cannot qualify for PATH. Next slide, please. All right, applying for PATH. think that this is the point where I get to pass the baton to the national lead for this program. And I just can't say enough about Jody Kenworthy and just how dedicated she's been to trying to make this program come together in a way that works for everyone. So thanks so much. And I'll let Jody take the baton from here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Julie. And first of all, I want to apologize. I don't know what happened. My computer just crashed and it was Zoom only. So Laura, thank you so much for taking over the slides because I failed at that. So thanks. And then I want to echo what Julie said. You know, this program has been really a joint effort between the agencies and working really with partners too, in terms of knowing this industry and understanding it. And this program really would not exist or look the way it does without the help of partners and at least for FSA working with Forest Service. They are really the technical experts and have been very helpful. So thank you. And Julie's been wonderful to work with. So I just want to put that out there and thank everyone. So I'm going to go into applying for PATH. What you'll do is when you're going to apply for PATH, the first thing you should do is find your local FSA Farm Service Agency center. And I would say call them before just showing up. A lot of them are appointment only. Some of them I'm not sure are even taking appointments, but doing everything through Zoom or Microsoft Teams or on the phone. So it's best to call. They can also walk you through what paperwork you might need to get together before the appointment to know what you need to provide for the application and other additional eligibility documents that we have or forms that we require. So those are listed here. The actual application itself is called the FSA 1118, and I'll go into that in a little bit. But before I do, there are 4 sort of eligibility documents that we need from all FSA customers. The AD 2047 is just for the individual. It gives, you know, sort of the demographics, their business or their individual, you know, tax ID numbers, so we know how to pay them, and who they are, and that they are who they say they are. And then also the 901 is only applies for entities, and it takes the each member's individual information down. The AD 2106 is also a demographic information form, and then the AD 1026 is a conservation compliance form that we need filled out. It's for highly erodible land and wetland. Basically, unless you own or operate on another, like on a farm or something that's sort of like the land is dug up and used or has the potential to be farmed, this form will really be very easy, and there's just a box you would fill out yourself that would just say it's not applicable, but we have to have that. It's required with all our programs, the conservation compliance. And then you'll need the application itself, and then if applicable, the IRS heavy highway vehicle use tax return form. But this is really something that the FSA office will go through with you and let you know what to fill out and why we need them. So that they'll be able to answer any detailed questions you have on those forms. Next slide, please. So when applying for PATH, you can submit the application in the following ways. You can go in person, and I see that Sherry put the address in the chat. To find your local FSA service center, you can postmark it in the mail. I would suggest if you're going to do that, you still call beforehand to make sure everything you're sending is correct and there's not a bunch of follow-up that needs to be done or something that you missed so you're actually not eligible. Or by or electronically, you can do it scanned, emailed, or faxed. You can also go to our website, farmers.gov, and sign up for a level 2 authentication. Sorry, I can never say that when I have to say it, but I can always say it at another time. If you're an individual, you can sign up for that and apply through our online, safe, secure portal, or you can work with the FSA office and work through the apps Box and OneSpan, which sort of, I think, encrypt the documents and allow for electronic signatures. Next slide, please. This is what the FSA 1118 looks like. I'll go through it in detail in a second, but it's basically just 2 pages. It goes through, part A goes through what you agreed to when signing. Part B is just the applicant's name, address, and phone number. Part C is the actual NACE codes and then the gross revenue. And Part D is certifying that you basically are an eligible applicant and that if applicable, you are providing copies of the 2294. Next slide, please. So when signing Part A of the application, you are agreeing to the following: to comply with and acknowledge the applicant is subject to all provisions in the NOFA for the PATH program, that the applicant meets the definition of a timber harvesting or timber hauling business, and 50% or more of their gross revenue is derived from harvesting and or hauling, that their gross revenue between January 1st, 2020 and December 1st, 2020 declined 10% or more when compared to the same time period in 2019. They've submitted and completed all the applicable forms and documents, and that they actually have done this within 60 days. Next slide, please. So Part C of the application is filling out first the principal business code, which is the NACE code, the gross revenue from 2019, and remember again, it's the 11th month period, and then the 2020 gross revenue also for the 11th month period. And you have different rows for each type of business. Also, I want to point out here that every application is approved or disapproved by what we call our county committees. They're elected officials within the county who look over the applications, and if they see any discrepancies that they have more questions on, they're allowed to ask and require more documentation to sort of support the claim on the application. And on top of that, we have spot checks. Each after the program ends, there will be randomly picked applications for us to look over and make sure that they are legitimate and not fraudulent. And so because of that, we require that you retain your documents for 3 years. Next slide, please. So for businesses that basically were created in 2019, never existed before, or dissolved in 2020, we have created it, and it's really all done in the software. To FSA will proportionally calculate to compare the 2 years together had they been in operation the same period of time. And I'll go over an example at the end of this presentation that sort of explains how that calculation works. But all you have to provide, if this is true, when filling it out, is your origination date, the date you were created in 2019, the business was created, or the dissolution date in 2020. Next slide, please. So in Part D of the application, you're certifying to all the following when signing, that the applicant and all members are U.S. citizens or legal aliens or a tribal entity or organization. They've provided the 2290 forms, and all information is true and correct to the best of their knowledge, and they're not an ineligible applicant. Next slide, please. Beyond the application, what does the applicant need to provide? So at the time of turning in the application, then you need the NACE code, and you also need to turn in the IRS 2290 form. Next slide, please. So about the IRS 2290 form, this is actually not required if you're a timber hauling business that only operates on tribal land. But otherwise it is required, and we know that the time period for the form goes from June to July, I think it is, or July to June of each year. You follow what the IRS has as the applicable year. So we need it for 19 and for 20. Next slide, please. Once the program started, we realized that these 3 NAICS codes and the IRS form 2290 were actually not, it was not easy for everyone to provide or have those NAICS codes. A lot more general NAICS codes were used by applicants. And so we wanted to make sure we sort of expanded the policy to make it so even those who were clearly eligible but didn't have those exact NAICS codes could apply and receive benefits from the program. So what it came up with is we have primary documentation that, as long as it provides evidence and the applicant can claim 50% or more of their gross revenue came from timber harvesting or timber hauling. Basically, this is up to our county committees to decide, yes, this is good enough primary documentation that supports that, then they can be approved even without those 3 NAICS codes. We have on top of that a list of secondary documentation that is really not good enough to support the claim. But if they have that information, the application plus the documentation can be sent up to national headquarters, and we will review the application and documentation ourselves to see if we find it reasonable enough and gives enough evidence for eligibility. Next slide, please. So this is a list of the primary documentation. It's on, I should have said this earlier, but I want to let you all know that there is a PATH website. It's www.farmers.gov/PATH, PATHH. It will have all this information, and it has FAQs. It has a link to the NOFA, a link to all the primary documentation that might be needed. So I'm not going to go through this one by one, but I want you to know that this information is available, that while the FSA offices should have all this and be able to explain it to you, it's also available online for you to look at. So this primary documentation is needed to support an application that does not have the NAICS codes or the 2290. Next slide, please. This is the secondary documentation. Forest Service and FSA do not believe that this actually in itself gives enough support for just the county committees to approve an application. But if documentation like this is sent up to the national office, we will review the application and decide if we think there's an eligibility for the application. Next slide, please. So disapprovals, this is when basically the county committee would disapprove an application. So if the program eligibility requirements are not met, if the person or legal entity applying is determined to not be an eligible applicant, the signature requirements were not met, or the applicant intentionally misrepresents their total gross revenue. We also tell FSA offices to never not accept an application. Anyone may apply. It's really at the approval or disapproval stage that will decide the eligibility of the applicant. Note that if an FSA 1118 was completed but never signed by the applicant, it's not actually considered disapproved. It's considered never filed because it's not signed. So make sure you sign your application. For pay limit, there's a pay limit to this program of $125,000, except for Indian tribe or tribal organizations. They're not subject to this cap. And I will put a link in the chat once I'm done presenting for the exact definition of what we follow for a tribal organization. Next slide, please. So the payment formula is as follows. This is mainly for just awareness. You do not have to calculate your payment at all. The PATH software will do that in our system. So it takes the gross revenue from January 1st, 2019 through December 1st, 2019, minus the gross revenue for January 1st, 2020 through December 1st, 2020, and multiply it by an 80% factor. That is a payment factor. That is just a factor in our program Later on, I'll talk about a program factor that might be applied, but the 80% is always used in the payment formula. Next slide, please. So in this program, there's an initial payment that is made once you sign up and have filled in and are approved, your application is approved and you have submitted all your eligibility documents, and then a final payment that will be issued hopefully within 30 days after the end of the program sign up deadline. Next slide, please. So please note there's a $200 million limit to the funding of PATH. And if the total calculated final payments, basically everyone's application, so what they would be to, in combination with the initial payment exceed $200 million, the final payment amounts may be factored. So that would be a program factor, or the maximum payment limitation of $125,000 may be reduced to stay within the available funding. So the final payments have not been, they will be calculated as once sign up is over. So this is where we really want to encourage people, apply sooner rather than later. You do have till October 15th, but after you apply, you also have potentially 60 days to turn in your eligibility paperwork. And if everyone's sort of, dragging their feet, turning that in, we can't calculate what the final payment will be until we have all of that information in and the payments have been made. The initial payments have been made, so we know how to what our pool or what the total amount of payments would be for the final payment. So we really encourage people to apply sooner rather than later. Please, do it now rather than wait till the 15th. Next slide, please. So the initial payment is calculated by and will be by following, and it will either be the lesser of the payment formula, which I stated earlier, or $2,000. And also note, if the payment is less than $2,000 or just happens to be $2,000 exactly, there will be no final payment. But as the previous slide stated, that there could be a reduction in payment limitation for the final payment or a payment factor, that will not be applied to the initial payment. You will keep the amount you get for the initial payment, that's yours. It will not be reduced. Next slide, please. So the final payment will be issued after the application period ends, and it will be equal to the payment formula minus the $2,000 of the initial payment. But then it will be remembered either factored or, well, it would always have a maximum of 125,000 pay limit, but it will then be potentially factored, or the payment limit may be decreased depending on how much there is payment wise calculated in terms of differences and how many applicants we have. Next slide. So I'm just going to go very quickly through a couple payment formula calculations. This is just for awareness, not anything you'll have to do. This is a very simple example. A business has been in operation all of 19 and 20. Their gross revenue for 2019 is $600,420. Remember, this is for 11-month period, and is $235,000 in 2020, also for 11-month period. So they had a gross revenue loss of 61%, clearly over the 10%. Next slide. The payment calculation is as follows. They take 2019 revenue, the 600,000 minus the 2020 revenue of 235,000, and multiply that by the 80% payment factor and get $292,336. The initial payment will be the lesser of that and 2,000, so they get $2,000. Final payment is they will be reduced for pay limit to 125,000 minus the initial payment, so their final payment will be $123,000. Next slide. This one is just a seasonal timber business. I want to note that while we have situations where if a business was created in 2019 or dissolved in 2020, we will proportionately calculate their gross revenue for the year. But if it is a seasonal timber business and it has been operating, has been in existence all of 19 and 20, it is considered the same as just a normal business that's been operating all year. We're not going to account for a couple of months that they might not have operated due to mud season. So the calculation that is in this is exactly the same as the calculation in the example I just did previously. So go to the next example, if you're willing. Thanks. And so this is the last example I have. It's very quickly, I'll go through. It's an example of a business that was created in 2019. So it was created on July 17th, 2019, and still in operation today. So therefore, it was in operation during the PATH program periods, January 1st, 2020 to December 1st, 2020, which is 336 days, and from July 17th, 2019 to December 1st, 2019, which is 138 days. The gross revenue for the business in 19 is 140,000, and in 20 is 200,000. Next slide, please. So this is what the calculation looks like. To get the 219 gross revenue, we have to proportion it to be equal to the 11 months that is equivalent to their 2020 gross revenue, because that's representative of the 11 month. Now the days are a day off because 2020 was actually a leap year. So it gets a little complicated, but basically what you want to do is we calculate the gross revenue per day and then multiply it by the number of days for the 11-month period. So we take the 140,000 divided by 138 days times 335 days, and you get $339,855 minus the 2020 gross revenue of 200,000 multiplied by 80%, you get almost $112,000. The initial payment is the lesser of, so it's the 2,000. The final payment is the payment because it's under the max payment limitation minus the 2,000, and the final payment will be $109,884. Next slide, please. So we'll go into questions. Any questions, Julie and I are here to take, and if we can't answer them, we will certainly make sure that we ask someone else and get back to you. And I'll put my email in the chat right now. So feel free, if you have questions down the road, to email me with any of them. But that's all for now. So thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jody. So we do have a couple questions in the chat. Julie has responded a little bit, and I'll go ahead and invite Jody and Julie to come on camera. And as others may want to ask a question, to do that too. I do see Tony has his hand raised. Tony, I'm just going to start with a question in the chat and those first, and then I'll come to you. So the first one was, why 11 months and not the full year?
So Julie and I have different theories for this. Congress mandated that, so it was in the legislation. So no matter what, that's what we have to go with. So that's why. Julie thinks that they might have made a mistake and forgotten the 3 in front of the 1. I think because it passed before the end of the actual calendar year, they only did it to the 1st. But really, I don't have an actual answer for that, except that we have to go with 11 months because that's what the legislation says.
Okay, thank you. Tony, did you have a question that you wanted to speak up with? Your hand went down, I think.
Yeah,
so for folks,
sorry, I didn't raise it. Sorry. Whoops.
No, okay, go ahead.
No, I didn't mean to raise it if I did. Sorry.
Oh, no worries at all. So when we pause for questions, that for anybody that wants to speak up verbally with a question, you can go ahead and speak up, or you can go over to the little reactions button at the bottom and raise your hand, and then I'll see that you have a question and I'll call on you. The next one was, is the IRS form 2290 needed for tribal fee lands that are off the reservation?
I think we need a clarification on what, Jim, what you mean by tribal fee lands.
Or maybe one of our tribal specialists that are on can help with that if Jim's not able to unmute right now. And Jim, if you can't find the mute button, you should see it if you hover your cursor to the lower left corner to click to unmute or over your own image.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, our original reservation was in a neighborhood of 26,000 acres, but over the years we have acquired fee lands adjacent to us, and it is owned by the tribe. Do we still need the IRS 2290 for those lands?
So Julie, I don't know if you want to weigh in, but I would say no if it's owned by the tribe, that's you know, equivalent to being on tribal land. Julie, you're muted.
I would defer to FSA on that. I think that's a policy decision in terms of interpretation. And if you see in my explanation of what the point of the rule, not the rule, the exemption is that if a business would never normally file that IRS form, then FSA couldn't expect them to submit it, if that helps. So if businesses that operate on that part of the land wouldn't normally file the IRS form 2290, then they wouldn't need to be required to submit it. Again, I think unless Cody or Reed, you can enlighten us a little bit more if there's anything unusual in terms of ownership by a tribe of lands that's distinctly different from the original tribal lands in terms of ownership. If that changes, you know, a business where they're operating and whether or not they would need to file something with IRS. I would assume that it would be the same as if it was the original, you know, tribal lands.
Well, what I'd like to do is not give you my opinion. So can we get the question in writing and FSA can follow through with the policy question?
What do you mean by in writing?
You put it in the chat.
We have it. Yeah, we have it in the
Okay.
chat.
Okay.
All right. So, and then just respond to, I guess, you know, we have everybody's contacts. And so that question might be pertinent to a lot of folks, especially share what your findings are with ITC. So they might be able to broadcast that situation out.
Yeah, and I'm not a tribal expert, but I would think it's the ownership of the land that matters. So is it a tribal business that owns the land? Is it the tribe that owns the land? I would think that that's more the deciding factor. So I think that's why we need to be clear about what the question is so that we can be, you know, complete and thorough in what the answer is. Do you want to elaborate a little bit more in terms of the ownership of the land that you're talking about?
Well, we do have lands that are owned by our enterprise, and we have lands that are owned by the tribal council. And I guess my question was specifically if the tribal council owns this land, even though it is in fee status and not trust status, do we need the 2290 IRS form?
Okay, I'll step out of this one. I think this is definitely an FSA for FSA to answer.
Yep.
That's a great question. I think it'll be a question for that a lot of folks will be interested in. Thanks for the question. It's important.
So I think I will get something back to you in writing. I think if it's something owned by the tribal council, it's probably going to be considered the same under the same rule. But I'll make sure to get something back, maybe to Laura, and she can send it out to everyone.
Thank you. I do see another hand raised. I'm just going to ask Jim if he could perhaps send a private chat to Laura with his email address or reply to the email that was sent out from her, just so we make sure to have the email address to follow up on that question. And then I'm going to turn it to Howard, who has a hand raised.
I just wanted to make a quick comment on the 2290. So the tribe itself for us, I work for the Nez Perce tribe in our Forestry and Fire Management Division. And our 2290 form is exempt through it just says exempt, and I just brought it up in the tax section. So because of us being federally recognized, the federal government just, we don't have to apply any mileage or anything to it. We put it in as exempt. Our executive director signs the form, and then we send it off to the.
So you still turn it in though? It just says it's
yeah, we still turn it in. There's nothing on it. There's no details in the tax computation, just a signature from our executive director. So.
And that's a perfect example of where just even that is more than enough to say you don't need to submit anything else. If you're able to show that, that's great.
Right. So yeah, they just want our VIN number off the truck, and that's about it. So, and then, but yeah, I just wanted to make sure that folks knew that it is simpler than you think to get these forms turned in. So.
Thank you.
It is, and oh, sorry. I was just going to say, we also do have, we have other situations clearly with applicants who have do not have their 2290, or their only copy was basically submitted to the IRS. So we have that primary documentation that can be used if you don't have a 2290. So there are other circumstances still, even let's say you don't meet the exception of not having to have one or whatever situation, there's ways around it, and we will make sure to work with you.
And I'll just explain this. The reason why in setting up the program, FSA decided to require this is that trucking is a huge industry, and it's, I mean, I don't even know how big in terms of numbers, but we wanted to make sure that you didn't have non-log truckers applying. And so you've got to figure out a way, how do you demonstrate that you really are a log trucker? And because this is required for 95% or so of businesses are picking up that number, then that's an easy, and it's a simple form that they have to file. It's at their fingertips if they file it. That's an easy way of demonstrating, yep, I'm a log trucker. So hopefully that makes sense.
Great, thanks so much. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. I'm going to do a nice long pause to see if there's any more questions that anybody would like to ask verbally. Just remember to unmute your mic. Okay, and I did see another one come into the chat. If there are non-tribal loggers or haulers working on the reservation where they are part of the tribal program or non-tribal program, where are the resources available to them?
So
this is Tim. I didn't get that quite point across there. We on the I'm in Minnesota on the Grand Portage Reservation, and we have loggers that are working on the reservation, but I sense that they would not be part of the tribal portion of this program, but they could be eligible under whatever else there is available. Am I reading that right?
yeah, so this program is available for everyone.
Right.
There are just some sort of exceptions or like the pay limit that are a little different for tribal organizations. But other than that, anyone who's a logger or a hauler can apply. It's same presentation for everyone.
So where would they go to be able to grab the resources to be able to apply for the program?
Probably the farmers.gov/PATH is the best resource, or calling their local FSA office and working with them. If they don't feel comfortable starting there, we've tried to work with state foresters, and they can probably help point them towards the FSA office.
Okay.
But really same steps, online and then calling the office.
Yeah, and those are the same links that we popped into the chat here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, for your question. And just to keep in mind, so this program is designed for businesses, not employees. And so as long as it's, they could be a sole proprietor, as long as it's a business, doesn't matter how they're formed, incorporated or LLC or whatnot, they can apply. And we've been told that for a lot of those sorts of businesses are really small. It's a very straightforward, easy process. At least we hope it is for most people. And the
Yeah,
local FSA offices have been amazing. I mean, they've even met with businesses outside their offices because of COVID to help them actually fill out the paperwork.
So
Some
the
people do it
biggest,
online electronically, but
the biggest indicator is who's at risk, basically, and that if that is just an individual operating under their social security number, then they can certainly apply. But if it's they're working for a business, then the business is really the one at risk, and they're the applicant.
Thank you. I do know we are a few minutes over, so thanks so much for folks standing by. I'm just going to do one more pause to see if there's any more questions. Remember to click the mute button to unmute yourself. There's another one that came into the chat. Do you think the program will extend beyond December 1st, 2020, since there are still COVID impacts?
I have no idea. That's really up to Congress to decide. But as of now, I've not heard anything. Doesn't mean it will or will not, really.
Julie, you're muted.
I'll weigh in with just my own personal opinion. Considering the loss to the sector, if it is as significant as it was estimated, and only 200 million is available, if the request is more than 200 million and significantly more than 200 million, I mean, right now there've been over at least about 3,000 applicants, Jody, so far. We're expecting anywhere of upwards of 10. Originally thought 15,000. It's hard to guess, but if there's enough of a demand and enough of a loss is demonstrated, it's anyone's guess, but that would make it more likely. Sorry, I've got a notice on my screen that just popped up. More than likely that there could possibly be additional assistance in the future, but again, that's up to Congress. Great question.
All right, well, thanks so much to all of you for participating today. I just popped the PowerPoint into the chat. Laura's gonna follow up and hopefully get the recording link as well as PowerPoint out through all the channels where the invite was originally sent to. So hopefully you'll receive the recording link that way. A huge thank you to Julie and Jody for the presentation today, and for Laura and all of ITC for hosting. We really appreciate that. And also to the captioner who provided the live captioning. So any other words in closing, I'll turn it back over, see if there's anything else to add. Okay, so good luck with the application process and get on it right away. Don't wait till October 15th, and thanks again.